Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Saturday. Today I want to talk to you about a hot topic in the Crested Gecko community, and that is that the Crested Gecko market is crashing and prices are falling and people are really worried and saying it's a bad time to be breeding Crested Geckos. So I want to talk a little bit about that today and whether or not that's true and what we can do going forward. So let's answer the question first. Is the Crested Gecko market crashing? And the answer to that is no. But is the Crested Gecko market correcting? And I would say the answer to that is yes. And we're going to explain why. I believe it comes down to two main factors. The first one being what I'll call the cycle of a hobby, and the second being basic supply and demand. So let's talk about the hobby side of this first. Whether most people want to admit it or not, Crested Gecko breeding, and I would say reptile breeding in general, is a hobby for the large majority of people. There's a small handful of people who do it as a small business, and an even smaller select few who do it full time. So for the majority of people who are doing it as a hobby, there is what I call a cycle of a hobby, basically. If you're in any other hobby rather than keeping reptiles, you'll know this too, but there's always people who are coming and going in any hobby. You can go into any Facebook group hobby and you'll see people who are saying that they're getting out and people who are getting in. It's just how it goes. And that cycle continues on and on and on and on. Now, the amount of time it takes between when people usually come and how long it takes them to leave can be, I'm sure, very different depending on the hobby. For me, I would say Crested Geckos is usually a 2 to 3 year cycle before people usually realize it's not for them and they decide to leave the hobby. So keep that in mind because we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. Now, with any hobby, you always want more people to be coming than there are leaving. Obviously, if people are coming into your hobby, that's a good thing because there's more people in the community, but that also means that the hobby is healthy and that it's growing and it's going to get bigger over time. If it's the opposite and more people are leaving, well then your hobby's dying and it'll eventually die out, and that's not what you want, obviously. I don't think that's what any of us would want for the Crested Gecko community or any reptile community for that matter. However, I would also say there's something that you probably don't want either, and that is rapid, extremely exponential growth of your hobby, because that can really mess up some things and create a lot of problems within that hobby for a short amount of time before things will level out again. And I believe that's kind of what's happening in the Crested Gecko community. Not that it's a problem, just that it's created some waves and some things that people aren't used to. And so I made a handy dandy little chart to show you what I'm talking about here. So I labeled this chart people getting into the hobby. This is my scientific yet unscientific chart to show you what's happening. So on the y-axis we have number of people in the hobby. You'll notice it's blank because I don't actually know how many people get into the hobby every year. I'm just using this as an example. And across the bottom we have the year. So I started this in 2016 just because I figure that's far enough back, and it goes up till 2023, right? So up until 2020, the beginning of 2020, I would say the amount of people getting into the Crested Gecko world was pretty steady, right? It was slowly rising, which is great because more people are coming than leaving. That means the hobby's growing. That's great. That's exactly what you want. But then starting in 2020, we had a huge increase in the amount of people getting into the hobby, as you can see here, through 2020 into 2021, a little bit into 2022, and now it's coming down. And this is the amount of new people who are entering the hobby every year, right? So in 2020, we all know what happened. People were stuck at home looking for something to do. And I'm sure some of it was, maybe I'm going to make some money from this. Other people just thought it would be cool. Whatever the case is, it doesn't really matter. There just happened to be a huge influx all at once of people getting into the Crested Gecko community. And this is not just Crested Geckos either. I can't say for certain, but I'm fairly positive that most other reptile communities, maybe like ball pythons and some of the easier animals to keep and breed, also experienced similar things. So scooting back to what I was talking about earlier with the cycle of the Crested Gecko hobby being 2 to 3 years, well, if you looked at all the people who got in, I would say most people got in 2020 to 2021. 2 to 3 years would be like this year and next year for the cycle of the hobby is what I'm calling it. Basically just people realizing it's not for them for whatever reason. Maybe it was the get rich quick people leaving. The other people just realize it's a lot of work. And the reason I say 2 to 3 years is because that gives you enough time to go through 1 or 2 breeding seasons, raise up 1 or 2 sets of babies from each year, and just overall a couple of years of taking care of your animals before you realize, you know what, this isn't really for me, and then people get out. So that's the first thing that I think is causing a lot of people to leave. Since there was just a huge influx in people to begin with, it was bound that there would be a somewhat large exodus of people at some point, right? And it just happens that I believe this is about that cycle time. So I think this is one of the main causes why people are starting to say that the Crested Gecko market is crashing. They're seeing people sell off their collections or half their collection or whatever, and they think things are starting to go south. But I mean, really, this was just bound to happen considering how many people joined the Crested Gecko community within the last 3 years. And actually, a fun little tidbit here, I did a poll on Instagram a couple weeks back asking people when did they start breeding Crested Geckos, and I got 99 results. The options were 2020 or later, or 2019 and before. 2 out of 3 people, or 67% of people, said that they started breeding Crested Geckos in 2020 or later, which I think also just proves my point of the huge influx in people who got in 2020, 2021, and 2022, which I think is just crazy and it's nuts, but I think it proves my point pretty well. So that was my first factor, was the cycle of a hobby, the number of people getting in versus the number of people getting out. And obviously the amount of people getting in 2020 through 2022 was huge, right? Well, inadvertently, that also caused a huge supply and demand issue, which is also the other reason I think people are freaking out. And a lot of people wouldn't know this because a lot of them started breeding within the last couple of years. If you've been around before 2020, I would say, you'll know that things in these last couple of years were very, I would say, highly abnormal as far as Crested Gecko pricing and how quickly they would sell. I remember being in 2020 and I remember going into the year with the things happening in the world and being worried that I wouldn't be able to sell my babies because people weren't going to be spending money. And instead it ended up being the opposite. And I didn't have enough babies to sell and people were messaging me trying to buy other things that I wasn't willing to sell. So it ended up being a crazy reverse of what I thought would happen. But anyway, this caused a huge supply and demand issue because picture this. Let's say you have 100 breeders, 100 breeders breeding Crested Geckos in 2019. You go into 2020, probably close to the same amount, right? Well, now all of a sudden, you got 300 people or 200 extra people wanting to buy Crested Geckos. What does that do? Well, that makes the demand for Crested Geckos go super high, sky high, right? And the supply is super low. That's why Crested Gecko prices went bananas in 2020, 2021, and the beginning of 2022. And basically you could put a price on just about anything and it would sell because you have so many people trying to get into the hobby and want to start breeding. So they're willing to spend just about anything to do so. And so if you were selling geckos, hopefully you cashed out because people were willing to pay anything for animals. Or maybe you were just fair pricing still and, didn't make a difference. But in any case, the demand was super high in those couple years and the supply was low. And luckily for you, I've been tracking Crested Gecko prices since about mid-2021. Now I can say that this chart here that I'm going to show you only starts in 2021. I could tell you just from my memory, and this is going off of MorphMarket, that before 2021, I would say at any given time there would be 800 to 1,500 Crested Geckos for sale on MorphMarket, depending on the season. And when babies are being born and that kind of stuff. But I would say that was pretty average, so keep that in mind. But this chart here starts July 1st, 2021, and there was about 1,000 Crested Geckos for sale on MorphMarket. And now we come into 2023 and we're sitting at just over 4,100 available. So what happened to make this go up so high in only 2 years? Well, what's the cycle of breeding Crested Geckos? I believe that if you buy babies, it's about 2.5 years. And if you start out with adults, it's, anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half. I give it 2.5 years for babies because it's about 2 years to get them up to breeding size. And then about 6 months for them to start producing eggs. The eggs hatch, the babies grow, and then they're like 3 months old. And probably about that size, you can start selling them, right? So 2.5 years from 2020, well, that would be mid-2022. If they started 2021, well, that's 2023. So I would say a lot of the people who started producing their own geckos, of all those people who got in a few years earlier, started selling them in 2022 and 2023. I mean, it would only make sense. They wanted to breed them, they bred them. Well, they're going to start having babies last year and this year. And that's why there's such a huge increase in the amount that are available. So really what I'm trying to tell you is that this all created the perfect storm. The supply and demand is super wonky right now just because of how many people started breeding all at once and how many geckos they started producing all at once. And now that the demand has fallen off, there's all those excess geckos, plus the natural hobby cycle, as I called it, just all coming to head all at one time, which I think is really causing this and what's freaking people out the most. And so what can you do? What's the light at the end of the tunnel to get through this? I think one of them is just, let it play out over the next year or two. The people who are getting out of the hobby will sell off their collections and get out, right? And I think things will start to steady out more like how they were. The good news is that not everybody who got in 2020 and 2021 is going to leave. So the people who are left there is going to make the hobby bigger. More people be in the Crested Gecko community, buying geckos, selling geckos, talking about geckos. That's a good thing. That's what you want. You don't want everybody who got into the hobby to leave. We'd be back to where we started. So that's a really good thing, is that there'll be more people than ever before in the Crested Gecko community. And the big wave of people who got in and wanted to leave will hopefully have left within the next year or two, right? So that's a good news. The next thing is, if you're getting into it now and you're on the tail end of this, or maybe you're a breeder looking to expand your collection, now is the best time to buy Crested Geckos in the last couple of years, I would say. People are more willing than ever before to deal on Crested Geckos, and prices have came down significantly. I can only tell you this right now from what I've seen. I don't have any data for this. I was planning to do that video a little bit later, but I'm trying to think of what I've seen recently. I saw an Axanthic marked down from 11,000 to 5. I've seen an Axanthic Lily White marked down from 15K to 6. I mean, crazy price reductions here, and not just on high-end geckos too, but on everything. I know I've cut my prices down quite a bit as well, just because things are starting to go back to what I would call more normal. And I think we're going to continue on this path. The people who want to get out are going to get out. People who want to stay are going to stay. My advice to you is just don't panic sell your whole collection. That's probably one of the worst things that you could do right now. Just stay on your path. Look at your breeders. Take a really hard look at your breeders. Are you producing anything that's new, that people are going to want, that the demand's going to be there for? Are you just pairing two random extreme harlequins together because you can? I would advise against that. Have a specific project in mind, something you're going for. And more importantly, make sure you like what you're producing and look at the stuff you're producing. Is it stuff you like? If you're just producing stuff to make stuff, I feel like you're not going to succeed in the coming future when things start slowing down a little bit and going more to normal and where demand is less intense, I'll say. The other thing to do is look at your pricing. A lot of people are still stuck in that, 2022, 2021, 2020 pricing. They're pricing their extreme harlequin males that are just average at $1,000. That's not going to sell today. I just don't think it's going to sell. I saw like a normal pinstripe male for $800. I don't see it personally. Of course you're welcome to do whatever you want, but take a good look at your pricing and think about what you would actually pay for it, what it's actually going to be worth in this new future where things are more back to normal. I'm going to keep saying that because that's what I feel like is happening, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either. It'll be nice to be over some of the craziness. I feel like it was a lot of fun, but just more back to normal. That's my opinion on all this. You're free to do what you want, obviously. Let me know down below in the comments. Do you feel similarly? I've seen this topic brought up so much lately. I wanted to talk about it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I appreciate all of you. And with that being said, I will see you in my next video. Also, what'd you guys think of my new little intro? I'm pretty proud of that. I think it looks good. I haven't changed my intro and my little YouTube card things that come out with my Instagram and stuff in like 2 or 3 years. Thought it was time for a little bit of an update. So let me know what you think about those too. And as promised, I have a new discount code for you. This could save you up to $280 off your Crested Gecko over on my website. We're getting down to the nitty gritty as far as ones that I have left, but nonetheless, this code could save you quite a bit of money. It's code SOSTICK in all caps. Use that, save yourself a bunch of money on a gecko. Anyway, I appreciate all of you for watching this video and sticking around to the end of it, and I hope to see you in my next one.